Welcome to Southwest Desert, where adventure meets the arid beauty of the American Southwest. Join us as we explore the rugged landscapes, uncover hidden historical gems, and dive deep into the rich legends and culture of this iconic region. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on the latest desert adventures. Please leave a like or comment. This is very helpful. Let's journey together into the heart of the Southwest Desert. "500 miles, alone, on horseback, through Comanche and Kiowa territory." Imagine being captured by hostile warriors after witnessing the brutal murder of your family. Then picture yourself seizing a single moment of opportunity, stealing a horse in the dead of night, and embarking on what might be the most remarkable escape in American frontier history. Welcome to Southwest Desert. I'm your host, Alan, and today we're traveling back to the Texas frontier of the 1860s to tell the extraordinary story of a woman known only as Mrs. L, whose harrowing journey across the Great Plains stands as one of the most incredible feats of survival in Western history. The year was 1867. On the Colorado River in western Texas stood Bab's Ranch, a humble jacal cabin that marked what was then the extreme limit of frontier civilization. This modest homestead was operated by a man known only as Bab, his wife, their 3 children, and a recently widowed relative by marriage, our protagonist, Mrs. L. Early in June, Bab traveled to a small Mexican town near the mountains, leaving his family behind with what he believed was a reasonable sense of security. After all, relations with the local Comanche tribes had seemed peaceful. It was a fatal miscalculation. Less than a week after Bab's departure, Mrs. Bab spotted several horsemen approaching, Comanche warriors in full war paint. 2 of her children were playing by the creek. She ran outside, calling desperately for them to come to the house where she intended to barricade the door and withstand a siege. But the children either didn't hear her or recognized the futility of running. They hid in the bushes as the warriors swept down. In moments, the Comanches found them, tied them together, and rushed into the cabin. What happened next was horrific. The warriors killed the baby and murdered Mrs. Bab when she resisted. Hearing the commotion, Mrs. L had rushed up a ladder into the cabin's attic. When she witnessed the killings, she couldn't suppress a cry of horror. The warriors dragged her down, but strangely, they didn't kill her. Instead, they bound her, threw her and the 2 surviving children across their horses, and galloped northward. General Marcy, who later documented this incident, described what followed as indescribable tortures. The Comanches traveled rapidly for days, making only brief stops. The captives were given little food or water and were forced to continue riding day and night across vast distances. Their journey took them across the Brazos, Wichita, Red, Canadian, and Arkansas rivers, several at flooding stages. The destination appeared to be the notorious Staked Plain of the Texas Panhandle, a harsh tableland that even experienced frontiersmen approached with caution. After traveling so far from any settlement that escape seemed impossible, the warriors relaxed their vigilance slightly. Mrs. L possessed what General Marcy called a firmness of purpose truly heroic. She resolved to escape at the first opportunity, carefully observing which horses had the best speed and endurance. Then, one dark night after an exhausting day of travel, when the warriors had fallen into deep sleep, she made her move. She crawled away from the sleeping children, selected the best horse, and quietly walked it away from camp. Once beyond earshot, she urged the horse into a gallop, heading northward, using the North Star as her guide. At dawn, she reached a high point overlooking a vast prairie. To her relief, there were no pursuers in sight, but relief quickly gave way to a new fear. She was completely alone in an enormous, featureless prairie with no landmarks, trails, or signs of human habitation. She had no food, no weapon, no proper clothing, just a horse and determination to survive. General Marcy eloquently described the terror of being lost on the Great Plains. The sensation of loneliness and despondency results from the appalling consciousness of being really and absolutely lost, with the realization that only 2 or 3 of the innumerable different points of direction will lead to salvation, and in complete ignorance as to which directions those might be. Many experienced travelers, when lost on the prairie, succumb to temporary insanity, but not Mrs. L. Her spirit remained unbroken. Using the sun by day and the North Star by night, she maintained her northward course. For hours she pushed her horse forward, knowing that every mile increased her chances of survival. As evening approached, her horse showed signs of exhaustion. Though desperately tired herself, having gone without sleep for what must have been 36 hours, she could not rest. A pack of wolves had picked up her trail. They followed behind, their howls growing louder as night deepened. Too dangerous to dismount, she had no choice but to keep moving through the darkness, fighting her own exhaustion while urging her failing horse forward. The wolves grew bolder, approaching closer, their eyes glowing in the darkness, snapping their jaws at the terrified horse's legs. Mrs. L. later described it as the howlings of 10,000 fiends from the infernal regions. Just when it seemed her horse would collapse, dawn broke. With the first light, the wolves mysteriously disappeared. Finally able to dismount, and knowing sleep would soon overwhelm her, Mrs. L. showed remarkable presence of mind. There were no trees to which she could tie her horse, so she tied one end of her lariat to the horse's neck and the other around her own waist before collapsing into slumber. She had no idea how long she slept until she was jolted awake by the sound of hoofbeats surrounding her. To her horror, she found herself encircled by another band of warriors, Kiowas of Lone Wolf's band, as she would later learn. They danced around her, brandishing their war clubs. Weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and fear, Mrs. L. fainted. When she regained consciousness, she had been taken to the Kiowa camp and turned over to the women of the tribe, who fed her and allowed her to rest. Though they treated her with more kindness than the Comanches had, she remained determined to escape again. During her time with the Kiowas, Mrs. L. observed that a group of warriors journeyed northward and returned 6 days later with ears of green corn. Knowing that the Plains tribes did not cultivate crops, she correctly deduced that they must have visited a white settlement and that it couldn't be more than 3 days' journey away. Her first escape attempt failed when dogs raised an alarm, but on a subsequent night she secured what she described as an excellent horse and rode away in the direction from which the warriors had brought the corn. For 3 days she rode hard, guided by the sun and stars. Then she encountered a new obstacle, a river in flood stage, its waters rushing violently between steep banks, most likely the Arkansas River. A less determined person might have been defeated by this barrier, but Mrs. L. didn't hesitate. She plunged her horse into the raging torrent and somehow made it safely to the opposite shore. And then, a miracle. Just a short distance beyond the river, she came upon a broad, well-beaten wagon road, the first sign of civilization. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For weeks, she had maintained an almost superhuman stoicism in the face of tragedy and hardship. Now, confronted with the prospect of salvation, her composure finally broke. When she spotted a wagon train approaching, she wept openly while offering prayers of gratitude. The wagons were under the direction of a trader named Robert Bent. When Mrs. L. approached him, her first words were a request for food. After satisfying her hunger, she tried to explain her situation. Bent was understandably skeptical. Here was a white woman, alone on the prairie, riding with an Indian saddle, her long hair loose, her clothing in tatters. When she told him she was from Texas, he shook his head in disbelief, pointing out that Texas was 500 or 600 miles distant. Mrs. L insisted her story was true and briefly described her captivity and escape. Still doubtful, Bent informed her that she had just crossed the Arkansas River and was on the Santa Fe Trail, about 15 miles from the nearest frontier settlement. They parted ways, Bent continuing westward while Mrs. L headed toward the settlements. As she rode away, Bent watched her, still puzzled. To his astonishment, after riding a short distance, she suddenly swung her leg over the horse in the manner of a Plains Indian woman, blew him a graceful kiss, and galloped away. By a remarkable coincidence, when Bent reported his strange encounter to the Indian agent at Fort Zara, the agent was in the midst of a council with the very band of Kiowas from whom Mrs. L had escaped. The warriors had just given their own account of her captivity and escape, a story so improbable that the agent had doubted it until Bent's confirmation. The agent dispatched a man to find Mrs. L and bring her to Council Grove, where she stayed for some time, hoping to gain information about the two Bab children who remained with the Comanches. She wanted to rescue them and return them to their father in Texas, but no news of the children ever came. According to General Marcy's account, Mrs. L eventually met and married a man at Council Grove. What became of her after that, history does not record. 500 miles through hostile territory, alone, on horseback, with no map, no compass, no supplies, pursued by wolves, recaptured and escaped again, swimming a raging river. The distance from the place of Mrs. L's initial capture to the point where she reached the Arkansas River was approximately 500 miles of largely waterless plain, a journey she made without encountering a single human habitation. As General Marcy wrote, "If any other woman in ancient or modern times has performed as signal an equestrian achievement as this, I have yet to learn it." Mrs. L's full name has been lost to history. We know almost nothing about her life before or after her ordeal, but her courage, resourcefulness, and indomitable will to survive stand as a testament to the extraordinary strength of the human spirit, a frontier legend that deserves to be remembered. Imagine being miles from civilization in the untamed American wilderness. Your ankle has been shattered by a bullet. Gangrene is setting in. Your only chance for survival? A fellow trapper with a hunting knife, a hastily notched blade, and a red-hot gun barrel. Welcome to Southwest Desert, where we uncover the extraordinary stories that shape the American West. I'm your host, Alan, and today we're diving into the remarkable and gruesome tale of how Thomas Smith became known to history as Pegleg. In the annals of frontier history, few figures embody the raw, unvarnished spirit of the American Southwest quite like Thomas Pegleg Smith. Born in 1797 in Kentucky, Smith was a product of the frontier, rugged, resourceful, and not always on the right side of the law. Long before his infamous nickname took hold, young Thomas cut his teeth working Mississippi River flatboats, where he developed the grit and savvy that would later serve him in the untamed territories of the West. The year 1824 marked a turning point for Smith. Leaving behind the relative civilization of the Mississippi, he joined a caravan bound for Santa Fe from St. Louis. This journey would take him into the heart of the American Southwest, where he established himself as a trapper, exploring territories few white men had seen. But Smith's frontier credentials came with a dark underbelly. To understand Pegleg Smith is to confront the brutal realities of frontier expansion. In 1827, Smith participated in what can only be described as a massacre alongside fellow trapper Milton Sublette. Their targets were the Papago people, now recognized as the Tohono O'odham. The violence was devastating. More than 100 indigenous people were killed, including women and children. The attackers reportedly justified this brutality as retaliation for alleged attacks on French trappers. Smith's moral compass continued to falter as he turned to increasingly dubious enterprises. Throughout the 1830s, he kidnapped indigenous children to sell into the Mexican slave trade. Later, he became notorious for horse theft in California, selling his stolen mounts at Bent's Fort for considerable profit. This was the complex and contradictory character of the man, capable of extraordinary survival skills and equally extraordinary cruelty. But it's the winter of 1828 that interests us most, the pivotal moment that would forever change Thomas Smith's identity. During a bitterly cold encampment near the Green River watershed, likely in an area known as Brown's Hole, an incident occurred that would transform Smith from an obscure frontier figure into the legendary Peg Leg. The exact circumstances of Smith's injury are shrouded in historical ambiguity. Over the years, multiple contradictory narratives have circulated, with Smith himself offering various embellished versions, particularly when liquor loosened his tongue. Some accounts describe an honorable combat in a fair fight, while others suggest a treacherous ambush. The weapon varies between a conventional rifle and an indigenous arrow. Even the anatomical details are inconsistent. Some versions place the wound just below the ankle, others directly through the joint, and still others below the knee. What remains consistent across all accounts is the severity of the injury. Smith's bone was completely shattered. In one version, Smith collapsed while trying to reach his weapon. In another, he successfully returned fire and eliminated his attacker. Smith himself vividly described the sensation as feeling like a whole mountain had fell on my left foot, and noted that he was bleeding like a stuck pig. Let's hear Smith's own words about that fateful moment, as recorded in what historians consider one of the most credible early accounts. The ball went plump through my left ankle and smashed the bones into splinters. My companions did what they could for me, but that wasn't much. They held a council and all agreed that mortification would set in, and that would be the end of Thomas Smith. The trappers privately discussed Smith's options. Then Milton Sublette, the same man who had accompanied Smith during the massacre a year earlier, presented the dire situation with frontier bluntness. "Smith, there is one chance for you, and only one. That leg must come off, or you're a dead man before the week is out. And even if we take it off, the chances are against you, especially as we've got to move from here." Smith's response revealed the pragmatic mindset required for frontier survival. "Well, boys, on the plains we've got to decide things mighty quick, and I reckon your judgment is about right. But can any of you perform the operation?" Sublette claimed he could, citing his observations of similar procedures performed by Crow Indians. When Smith asked about his surgical qualifications, Sublette simply stated he had seen it done before. This was frontier medicine at its most basic, not formal training, but observational learning in the harshest of environments. Smith's decision was as swift as it was necessary. "Go ahead, then. It's my duty not to lose a chance." What followed was an extraordinary display of frontier resourcefulness and a testament to human endurance. The trappers, with no medical instruments at their disposal, adapted their hunting tools for this life-saving surgery. A standard hunting knife was meticulously sharpened on stone to create a precision-cutting instrument. A second knife was deliberately notched using a hatchet to create a crude but functional bone saw. A gun barrel was heated to glowing red in the campfire, ready to cauterize the wound. To prepare Smith for this excruciating ordeal, the trappers secured him against a tree to prevent movement during the procedure. His only anesthetic? approximately 1 pint of whiskey. Despite Smith's general reputation for courage, the fear he experienced was palpable. He described feeling like a drawed skunk, a colorful frontier expression indicating extreme anxiety. Yet in that final moment, determination prevailed. In Smith's own words, "I finally grit my teeth and gave the signal." The procedure itself was as methodical as it was brutal. First, the trappers applied a tourniquet using a green deer hide strip, pulled so tight above Smith's knee that it left a permanent indentation in his flesh. With blood flow restricted, Sublet made the initial incision with the sharpened knife, cutting cleanly to the bone below the knee. The initial cut was tolerated reasonably well, as the tourniquet had already numbed much of Smith's leg. After the flesh was retracted to expose the bone structure, both leg bones were methodically sawed through with the notched knife. The moment the limb was severed, the heated gun barrel was immediately applied to cauterize the wound. Smith's colorful description of this moment has been preserved. "My stump fizzled and smoked worse than a venison steak." The pain was so intense that Smith, who had never before lost consciousness from injury, let out a single powerful scream, reportedly audible from a considerable distance, before mercifully passing out. In the critical post-surgical phase, the trappers demonstrated surprising medical sophistication. They comprehensively bandaged the surgical site and applied a birch bark poultice to the stump. Perhaps most ingenious was their continuous irrigation system. A flask with a punctured bottom was suspended above the wound, providing a constant drip of water to cool the inflammation. Smith remained immobile for more than 2 weeks before the group attempted to travel. Even then, movement was gradual, with frequent dismounting for rest. The physical toll was severe. Smith described himself as "nothing but a skeleton," and noted that it was more than 6 months before I was my own man again. The story of Smith's recovery reveals another dimension of frontier medicine that historians often overlook: the crucial role of indigenous knowledge. Eventually, Smith was transferred to a Ute village for specialized care, where indigenous women applied traditional medicine practices that likely saved his life. They prepared medicinal roots by chewing them into a paste, then applied this directly to the wound site. Even after this intervention, complications arose. A loose bone fragment developed at the amputation site, requiring extraction. In another remarkable display of frontier improvisation, Milton Sublet repurposed a bullet mold as surgical forceps to remove the fragment. Smith's adaptation to his disability became the stuff of legend. He crafted his own prosthetic, a wooden peg leg carved from oak, designed for functionality and easy removal when necessary. This prosthetic would become so central to his identity that Peg Leg permanently replaced Thomas as his primary identifier. The Ute people gave him a new name as well, Wake Tako, meaning the man with one foot. Always resourceful, Smith even discovered tactical advantages to his new appendage. In tavern confrontations, which were apparently frequent, he would use his wooden leg as an improvised club. One contemporary account notes that Smith's peg leg proved surprisingly effective during barroom arguments as an unexpected weapon. Smith's final years were as colorful as his early ones. He married multiple indigenous women and eventually settled in northeastern Utah Territory. He frequently claimed to have discovered gold deposits, often displaying gold-bearing ore to support his claims. Whether these were legitimate discoveries or elaborate cons remains debated by historians. When Thomas Peg Leg Smith died in 1866, he left behind a legacy that embodied both the resilience and the ruthlessness of America's Western expansion. His amputation story, preserved through oral history and early written accounts, provides a rare window into what medical historian Robert F. Karolowitz called the necessary, albeit amateur, medical practices of the frontier in his 1967 book, Doctors of the Old West. What makes Smith's story so compelling isn't just the gruesome details of his impromptu surgery, but what it represents, the extraordinary measures humans will take to survive, the ingenuity born of desperate circumstances, and the complex moral fabric of frontier society. In an era before antiseptics, anesthesia, or antibiotics, a hunting knife, a notched blade, and a red-hot gun barrel saved a life that might otherwise have been lost to history. Thomas Smith's transformation into Pegleg Smith reminds us that our historical frontier heroes were complex, contradictory figures, capable of both tremendous courage and troubling cruelty. Their stories, like the American West itself, resist simple categorization. If you would like to contribute to my channel, join my Patreon community and discover my art print products on my website in the links provided in my description. Also, if you would like a particular image from my videos, give the timestamp for the image, and I will upload it to my website and Patreon. Thank you. On a moonless night in 1874, two Native American scouts named Johnson and Job crept silently along the rim of Palo Duro Canyon. Below them lay the last great stronghold of the Comanche Empire, their fires dotting the canyon floor like fallen stars. These scouts weren't Comanche, they were Tonkawa, and their presence that night would help bring about the end of an era in American frontier history. Their story, however, begins long before this fateful night, in a tale that weaves together exceptional military prowess, unwavering loyalty, and ultimately, devastating loss. Today, the legacy of the Tonkawa, once considered Texas's most steadfast allies, survives in just three haunting forms: blood-stained battlefields scattered across the frontier, a collection of weathered weapons gathering dust in museums, and the modest names of a small hamlet and an unremarkable creek. Yet behind these sparse remnants lies an extraordinary saga that shaped the destiny of the American Southwest. The people who called themselves Tonkawa, meaning those like humans, were far more complex than their simple name suggested. They weren't a single unified tribe, but rather a sophisticated confederation of distinct groups who made their home in the challenging terrain of the Edwards Plateau. Their appearance alone set them apart from other Plains tribes. Elaborate tattoos adorned their bodies, telling stories of battles won and honors earned. They moved through the landscape with their carefully crafted bows and distinctive long lances, weapons that would become legendary in their roles as Texas's most skilled scouts. Their mastery of the land was absolute. The Tonkawa possessed an intimate knowledge of the Edwards Plateau's hidden springs, secret canyon passages, and seasonal game movements. This deep connection to the territory would prove invaluable in their future role as scouts, but it also made their eventual displacement all the more tragic. The Tonkawa approach to warfare transcended mere physical combat. It was a holistic system that merged the spiritual with the tactical. Their pre-battle preparation rituals were elaborate affairs that spoke to their sophisticated understanding of both the physical and supernatural worlds. Warriors would carefully treat their weapons, dipping arrow points and darts in mistletoe juice, a practice they believed imbued their armaments with supernatural potency. Their pre-battle body painting ritual was equally complex and meaningful. Warriors would begin by creating a small pool of saliva in their palms, a simple act that held deep spiritual significance. Into this natural medium, they would mix an array of carefully chosen pigments, red for blood and courage, green for the earth's strength, yellow for the sun's power, and ochre for connection to the soil of their homeland. These colors would be applied in dramatic streaking smears across their skin, transforming warriors into living symbols of their martial philosophy. In combat, the Tonkawa displayed abilities that seemed to defy human limitations. Their stealth capabilities were legendary. Scouts could move through enemy camps while their opponents slept, gathering crucial intelligence without disturbing a single soul. Even more remarkably, they could lead entire cavalry units through hostile territory without detection, a skill that would prove invaluable in countless military campaigns. Their post-combat rituals, while shocking to their white allies, were deeply rooted in their spiritual and martial traditions. The taking of scalps, complete with ears, was just the beginning. In a practice they considered good medicine, they would consume a small piece of skin from each breast of their fallen enemies. This act, they believed, transferred the warrior's strength and courage to them, creating a physical and spiritual connection with their martial achievements. The worth of Tonkawa Scouts to Texas forces was quite literally immeasurable. Army commanders, recognizing their extraordinary value, often paid for the Scouts' provisions from their own pockets, an unusual practice that spoke volumes about their importance. The common wisdom held that a few Tonkawa Scouts were worth more than 2 or 3 companies of regular soldiers, and events would prove this assessment conservative. Their alliance with white settlers was cemented by a shared enemy, the Comanche, and this common cause would shape the destiny of both peoples. The Tonkawas' traditional enmity with the Comanche made them natural allies of the Texas settlers, and they quickly proved themselves invaluable in the ongoing struggle against the Lords of the Plains. The Battle of Plum Creek in August 1840 serves as perhaps the finest example of the Tonkawas' military value. When nearly 1,000 Comanche warriors under the legendary Chief Buffalo Hump launched a massive raid that reached as far as Linville on Lavaca Bay, it was 13 Tonkawa Scouts under Chief Placido who would prove crucial to the Texas response. The scale of the Comanche raid was unprecedented. Buffalo Hump's warriors had swept through settlements like a prairie fire, reaching all the way to the Gulf Coast. Working with Texas forces led by Burleson, Caldwell, and Felix Houston, Placido's scouts accurately predicted the Comanche movement to Plum Creek, using their intimate knowledge of both the terrain and Comanche tactics to anticipate their enemy's retreat route. The battle unfolded exactly as the Tonkawa had foreseen. The Comanche raiders, weighed down by their plunder and stolen horses, found themselves scattered and vulnerable. In the ensuing chaos, 80 Comanche warriors fell, while the Texan forces suffered only a single casualty. Perhaps most remarkable was the sheer endurance of the Tonkawa Scouts, who ran on foot alongside Burleson's forces for more than 30 miles during the pursuit, a feat that demonstrated both their physical conditioning and their absolute commitment to the fight. Chief Placido's leadership during the battle was so exceptional that he received a formal citation for bravery, an honor rarely bestowed upon Native American leaders of that era. His strategic insight and tactical leadership had helped turn what could have been a devastating raid into a decisive victory for Texas forces. The Red River Campaign of May 1858 further cemented the Tonkawas' reputation as invaluable allies. Under the leadership of Ranger Rip Ford, the campaign began with a successful strike against a small Comanche camp. Though 2 warriors escaped to warn their main force, this initial engagement set the stage for an even more significant battle that would become legendary in frontier history. The confrontation with 300 Comanche warriors led by Iron Jacket would prove to be one of the most dramatic engagements of the frontier era. Iron Jacket, whose name came from the ancient Spanish coat of mail he wore in battle, was believed by his people to be invulnerable to bullets. The Tonkawa Scouts, however, helped position Texas forces for a shot that would prove this belief tragically false, A well-aimed round from a sharp's rifle found its mark despite the leader's armor. What followed was a 7-hour running battle that proved a crucial point. The Comanche could be defeated on their own territory. The pursuit continued until horses on both sides were completely exhausted, marking a turning point in the frontier conflict. The myth of Comanche invincibility had been shattered, due in no small part to the Tonkawa's guidance and combat prowess. The Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in September 1874 represented the culmination of the Tonkawa Scouts' military partnership with Texas forces. The two scouts who had crept along the canyon rim that moonless night, Johnson and Job, worked with intelligence from captured Comanchero Jose Tafoya to lead Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's forces to what would become the final decisive engagement of the Comanche Wars. The Tonkawa Scouts' expertise was crucial in executing the attack. They guided the forces in their treacherous descent into the canyon and successfully eliminated Comanche sentries, allowing for a surprise attack that caught the camp completely unaware. Though the Comanche warriors managed to cover the escape of their women and children, resulting in only 4 casualties, the destruction wrought upon their camp was total. In what would prove to be a masterstroke, Mackenzie ordered the slaughter of the Comanche horse herd, more than 1,000 animals. This single act stripped the Comanche of their mobility and military effectiveness, marking the end of their dominance on the southern plains. The Tonkawa Scouts had helped bring about the end of an era. Yet the very loyalty that made the Tonkawa such valuable allies would ultimately contribute to their downfall. In 1859, they were moved to the Brazos Reservation in Indian Territory, a displacement that would prove devastating to their traditional way of life. Their steadfast alliance with the Confederacy during the Civil War would bring even greater tragedy. In 1862, near Anadarko, Oklahoma, other tribes, the Delaware, Shawnee, and Caddo, attacked the Tonkawa in retaliation for their Confederate loyalty. The assault was devastating. 137 of their 300 remaining members were killed, a loss from which the tribe would never fully recover. Though they found temporary refuge at Fort Griffin, their final relocation in 1884 to the Oakland Agency in Ponca City, Oklahoma, marked the beginning of their dissolution as a distinct people. The proud warriors who had once been the terror of the Comanche became impoverished rural workers, gradually absorbed into other tribes. Their children would grow up far from the Edwards Plateau, their traditional stories and practices slowly fading with each passing generation. The fate of the Tonkawa serves as a haunting reminder of the complex and often tragic nature of Native American alliances in the American frontier. Like the Cherokees and Seminoles before them, their loyalty to white settlers ultimately resulted in their displacement and virtual extinction. The blood-stained battlefields have long since been reclaimed by prairie grass. The collected weapons gather dust in museum cases, and few remember the significance of that small hamlet and unremarkable creek. Yet the story of the Tonkawa, their skill, their loyalty, and their sacrifice remains an indelible part of the American frontier experience, a testament to both the complexity of human alliances and the often terrible price of unwavering loyalty. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman, Alan, for another Southwest adventure. Welcome to Southwest Desert, where we explore the untold stories of the American Southwest. Today we are looking at the 1860s, where a complex struggle was unfolding in the shadow of the Civil War. While Union and Confederate armies clashed in the East, a different kind of war raged in the territories of New Mexico and Arizona, one that would reshape the Southwest forever. In the scorching deserts and rugged mountains of the Southwest, the U.S. Army found itself facing not one, but 3 formidable enemies. The Apache tribes led by the cunning Cochise, the powerful Navajo Nation, and Confederate forces pushing westward in a bid to secure vital resources. It was a three-front war unlike any other in American history. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how differently these conflicts played out. While the struggles with the Navajo and Confederates would be resolved before Appomattox, the Apache War would continue long after the Civil War ended, evolving into a brutal guerrilla conflict that would define the region for decades. From the indigenous perspective, the Civil War was largely irrelevant. The political divisions between North and South meant nothing to Apache raiders who moved freely across what Americans and Mexicans considered national borders. To them, the U.S.-Mexico border was simply an artificial line in the sand, one they routinely crossed for raids, establishing camps wherever they pleased. This border-crossing strategy gave them a significant tactical advantage, frustrating military leaders on both sides of the line. The Confederacy's ambitions in the Southwest were bold but short-lived. Their plan: use New Mexico as a stepping stone to access the gold fields of Colorado and California. These resources could have tipped the scales of the war dramatically in their favor. But after their defeat at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March 1862, sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West, Confederate aspirations in the region were effectively crushed. Enter Colonel James Carleton and his 800-man California Volunteer Brigade. Originally dispatched to combat the Confederate threat, these men would find themselves fighting an entirely different enemy once they arrived. The Confederate invasion had been repelled, but the Apache War was just heating up. Their first significant engagement came at Apache Pass in July 1862, the very site where Lieutenant George Bascom's disastrous encounter with Cochise had ignited hostilities just a year earlier. The two-day battle left 2 of Carleton's men dead, 9 Apache warriors killed, and several wounded, including the influential Apache leader Mangus Coloradas. The military presence in the region was substantial. Under Carleton's command, who would soon be promoted to brigadier general, were 6 full regiments, most notably the 1st New Mexico Infantry Regiment led by the legendary Kit Carson. Before we continue with the military campaigns, let's take a moment to understand who Kit Carson was. Born in Missouri in 1809, Carson traveled to New Mexico at just 19 years old seeking his fortune. He built a career as a trapper and guide throughout the Southwest and California, becoming part of that unique breed of mountain men who opened the American frontier. Carson's reputation grew when he accompanied John Charles Fremont on his expeditions in the 1840s, and by the 1850s, he was the most sought-after guide and scout in New Mexico. When the Civil War broke out, Carson received a commission as a colonel in September 1862, taking command of the 1st New Mexico Cavalry to fight against the Mescalero Apache. Carson's first mission from General Carleton was clear: force the Mescalero Apache onto the Bosque Redondo Reservation, a desolate stretch of land on the Pecos River near Fort Sumner in east-central New Mexico. To accomplish this, he reactivated the previously closed Fort Stanton southeast of Santa Fe as his base of operations. By the summer of 1863, Carson had made significant progress against the Mescalero raiders. His success led Carleton to assign him an even more challenging task: subjugating the Navajo, the dominant indigenous power in the Southwest. This new mission represented a monumental challenge, even for someone of Carson's abilities. The Navajo were numerous and powerful, and the plan called for relocating them some 300 miles from their revered homeland. In August 1863, Carson led 6 companies of the 1st New Mexico Cavalry on a month-long expedition into Navajo territory in northeastern Arizona. Rather than seeking decisive battles, Carson employed a strategy of economic warfare. His forces destroyed Navajo crops and confiscated livestock, aiming to make life unsustainable in their homeland. Combat engagements were limited. Most captives were women and children, and of the 4 Navajo killed during this initial campaign, 2 were non-combatants. The U.S. forces lost 1 officer to a sniper. A similar expedition in November yielded comparable results: few skirmishes, a number of women and children taken prisoner, but significant damage to Navajo resources. Over 200 acres of crops were destroyed during these operations. The Navajo weren't passive victims, however. In December 1863 and January 1864, they launched bold raids against the Mescalero who had been relocated to Bosque Redondo, attempting to recapture livestock to replace what they had lost to Carson's troops. The military response was swift and involved multiple units, and even Mescalero scouts who had aligned with the U.S. forces. The first battle on December 16th saw Henry Wallen's 7th Infantry Regiment engage the Navajo, killing about a dozen warriors for the loss of 1 Mescalero ally. Though the Navajo escaped, they were forced to abandon the stolen livestock. A second major raid on January 4th, 1864, led to an all-day battle in freezing conditions. Indian agent Lorenzo Labadie coordinated a response with Mescalero allies. By day's end, approximately 40 Navajo lay dead, with no losses reported on the U.S. side. Once again, the Navajo were forced to flee without their prize. Following these raids, General Carleton ordered a winter offensive that would become the decisive operation of the Navajo campaign. The target was Canyon de Chelly, an 80,000-acre labyrinth of canyons surrounded by vertical cliffs that served as the sanctum sanctorum of the Navajo world. Few non-Navajo had entered this sacred place since the mysterious disappearance of the Anasazi centuries earlier. On January 12, 1864, 2 columns of the 1st New Mexico Cavalry under Carson's command entered the canyon. Though the Navajo held the high ground on the cliff walls, the troopers could cut off supplies and movement through the canyon. The 2-day operation resulted in a series of firefights that left 23 Navajo dead. The brutal January weather proved to be Carson's strongest ally. Nearly 600 Navajo surrendered that month, with over 1,200 more giving up by the end of February. Manuelito's band held out the longest, but eventually even they were forced to surrender, marking the end of organized Navajo resistance. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in this history, the forced relocation to Bosque Redondo in the summer of 1864. An estimated 8,000 Navajo were marched the 300 miles from their homeland to the reservation in what became known as the Long Walk, a journey reminiscent of the Trail of Tears that had befallen the Cherokee 3 decades earlier. Conditions at Bosque Redondo were unpleasant, to say the least. The Navajo found themselves sharing the reservation with their traditional enemies, the Mescalero, creating internal conflicts that only added to their suffering. However, unlike the permanent displacement of the Cherokee, the Navajo exile proved relatively short. In 1868, the U.S. government decided to uproot them from Bosque Redondo and return them to northeast Arizona. To their credit, the Navajo honored their peace agreement with American settlers, and today, their reservation, the largest in the nation, still encompasses their beloved Canyon de Chelly. While the Navajo War was concluding, the conflict with the Apache continued in the Southern Territories. Captain James Whitlock's 5th California Infantry conducted several significant operations in early 1864. In February, they achieved a rare surprise on an Apache band when 19 warriors brazenly rode into the mining town of Pinos Altos. The resulting ambush killed 13 Apache, including Luis, who had succeeded Mangus Coloradas as a leader. 2 months later, on April 7th, Whitlock's men successfully tracked an Apache raiding party that had stolen livestock to Sierra Bonita, again achieving surprise and killing 21 of approximately 30 Apache warriors. But the tables turned on May 4th when Apache fighters ambushed a detachment of the 5th California at Doubtful Canyon, Arizona, killing 2 soldiers while losing 10 of their own. With the Navajo campaign completed, General Carleton launched a comprehensive spring offensive against the Apache in 1864. The strategy mirrored Carson's successful approach with the Navajo, a scorched earth campaign targeting Apache infrastructure rather than attempting to engage warriors who were, as contemporary accounts noted, difficult to track and almost impossible to catch. Their objective was to sweep the Gila River drainage area, marching north from Fort Bowie in southeastern Arizona, destroying Apache encampments as they went. One of the most significant engagements came on May 29th, when Captain Thomas Tidball led an 86-man strike force against Apache settlements in Mescal Creek Canyon. The attack resulted in the destruction of 2 large settlements, with 51 Apache killed and 16 captured, mainly women and children. Another notable incident occurred during Captain Julius Shaw's patrol along the San Carlos River in early June. After destroying a small encampment, Shaw's men encountered a group of Apache who mistook them for traders. In a bizarre episode, both groups actually camped together overnight due to this mutual misunderstanding. The following morning, Shaw revealed their military identity, leading to tense negotiations. The Apache claimed they only raided in Mexico, not in U.S. territory, and promised to release hostages and return, a promise they never fulfilled. The subsequent battle left approximately 30 of the 76 Apache dead. The final major operation of the Civil War period came in late July 1864, when Major Thomas Blakeney led the 1st California Cavalry on a week-long sweep through the Sierra Pinal region. After an initial attempt at negotiations broke down, combat ensued, resulting in 10 Apache killed, 2 captured, and significant property destruction. In a clever tactical move, Blakeney left behind a small detachment to ambush Apache returning to the site, killing an additional 5 warriors. This marked the end of major Apache combat operations during the Civil War period, though raiding and skirmishing would continue at a lower intensity. When the Civil War concluded, General Carleton returned to California with his volunteer regiments, and regular U.S. Army units took over operations in the Southwest. The Apache War would continue under different leadership, extending well beyond the end of the Civil War. The story of the Southwest during the Civil War reveals how the conflict extended far beyond the famous battlefields of the East. While Gettysburg and Antietam dominate our Civil War narrative, equally consequential struggles were reshaping the American Southwest. The campaigns against the Apache and Navajo would forever alter the region's demographic landscape and set the stage for the final chapter of the Indian Wars that would define the late 19th century American West. Join us next time as we explore another forgotten chapter of American Southwest history. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan for another Southwest story. Check out my large catalog of Southwest videos and playlists on historical tales, legends, lost gold stories, and adult bedtime stories. If you like a certain image, tell me in comments and give timestamp. Happy trails! Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.